That's all we need. Hello and welcome to the final episode of the season for the Tigers Down Under. I'm your host Alex, and with me I have Dan. How are you, Dan?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. How are you?
Yeah, very good, very good. And we've also got Logan. How are you?
Alex, I'm well. I'm feeling extremely underdressed for the occasion, having jumped on and seen both the lads in full kits, and I've come straight from work, so I will have to apologise, but maybe I'll make a pledge that the first episode next year I'll dress up for the occasion.
Hey, look, you got a sharp haircut working out for you, so that's totally fine. Might actually start with you because we had Dan on last week to discuss the news about Rosenior's departure from the club, and I suppose it feeds into the broader discussion around how we finished off the season. I know we'd been talking in that would it have been the preview for the Plymouth episode, perhaps, Logan, where we were talking about games that got away from us this season and might have cost us a playoff place. I guess feeding into all of that, your assessment on Rosenior's departure and how that season sort of finished off.
Yeah, well, look, I guess firstly, I think I'd probably echo the sentiments of everyone in the Tigers Nation to say that they were shocked. I don't think anyone could have predicted it. Personally, it was one of those things that I think I'd probably always thought that the thing that I liked about Rosenior that perhaps separated him from the managers in the past that we've had, it was someone who was really trying to, get a fundamental playing philosophy as opposed to just like, let's, chop and change players and all that kind of stuff. And I thought that was a very different approach. And, we'd seen steady progress since he took over, where we survived relegation, then finished admirably on the league table, and then to only miss out on the playoffs on the final day. And, as you mentioned, it could have been one of those remarkable football stories if we had performed at Plymouth on the last day and had other results go our way, regardless of how unlikely, it was. But the fact is, it was still in play on the final day. And I think that's a real sticking point as to why perhaps it has left us with such a bitter taste, not only because, there's the romance of the fact that, we're talking about a manager who clearly cares about the club and has a deep connection, to kind of say goodbye to him to what feels really premature, given the fact that everything appeared really rosy on the surface. And I guess the fact that many of the City fans still have a bit of, PTSD post-Allen era. Everything that Kessler and Ajun had done up until then was, A triple plus. And so this is probably the first thing that we have come across that gives the fans a kind of reason to doubt or be skeptical. And I think that, the ghosts of our past are kind of somewhat feeling like they're coming back to haunt us. And I think that's, why everyone's healthily a little bit unsettled and a little bit shocked by the decision.
It does give vibes of the Barmby sacking by the Allams. And of course that did bring in Steve Bruce and promotion that came with it. So hopefully it follows that same trajectory. But yeah, it certainly does feel like a fork in the road, perhaps, in terms of where we go. And I'm assuming that was a pun intended when you said everything looked rosy on the surface. That was quite good. I enjoyed that.
Look, I didn't intend for that, but I appreciate you picking it up. I guess, and if I was to just add one more thing, I don't want to. I probably want to get into the episode, but I think if there's a silver lining, I do really appreciate the fact that it was quick. I feel like Ajun hasn't kind of rested on his laurels and made this off-season an incredibly, uncertain time. It looks like he's acted very quick. You talk about ripping Band-Aids off. I imagine that would have been an incredibly tough discussion because I'm just thinking if I'm Liam Rosenior, I don't know how I would have handled that conversation, given, all the signs that we've seen, the fact that he had a contract extension no less than 6 months ago. Like there's so many things. And even having heard Ajun, appear in the media, I'm still not really sure about his explanation as to why he's changed the gaffer. But if there's one thing that we can take away, it was quite quick.
Yeah, and I guess just as a final point on the departure, maybe I'll throw to you on this one, Dan. We sort of talked last week about Ajun's reasoning and talking about the style of play, etc. But and it'll probably flow into our discussion around the games in particular that changed the season. But in terms of the business that we did in January, and I think Ajun spoke about the fact that the investment that we had as sort of changing the expectations. Do you think it was fair to have that increase? I guess what I mean is, how much of it do we think was down to Rosenior sort of saying to Ajun, yeah, if you give me these players, if you back me in, I can get the playoffs, versus Ajun saying to Rosenior, we're going to give you these players, we think we can do it, and Rosenior almost being not hamstrung, but sort of, I suppose, stuck in this difficult position of saying, well, look, we kind of go, okay, well, I thought this was a long-term plan. All of a sudden it's becoming quite short-term and I just have to do my best.
Yeah, I think we sort of touched on it last week in the discussion that it seems it is a very strange situation, with a contract extension in December, and then a transfer January where he was, we were fairly heavily backed, quite a number of exciting players brought in, and then to continue to progress. Yeah, it was a little bit up and down in that second half of the season with. And as again we mentioned, injuries and AFCON and different things like that have sort of, as well as like just trying to bed 5 players into a team in the middle of the season and get them up to speed like really quickly. And to his credit, I know Zaruri ended up injured for most of it, but came in and scored some important goals and made some good contributions very quickly. Obviously, Carvalho, probably the pick of those signings. Giles had his moments. I think started to get deployed a little bit higher and seemed to work a little bit better. I think his as an attacking fullback doesn't really suit Rosenior's style of being really trying to be really solid at the back and then progressing forward. But Amir Abdush, came in and worked really hard and seemed to cement a place in that team. So I think generally to get all those players to come in and bed really quickly and perform and contribute is impressive in itself. But yeah, I just find with all of that, and then to get to the end and just miss out on playoffs and then say, it's a difference of it. It's a difference in philosophies. It just seems very strange because I feel like since day one that Rosenior came in, he said, this is the football I want to play and this is how I want to play. Yeah. And it's been that the whole way, albeit there's been, initially he came in and there was we just had to shore up the defense and we had to learn how to shut teams out and lock it up. And that was the priority at the end of the previous season when he first came in. And we did that. We secured another season in the championship. And this year, then it was about, progressing and pushing forward. And you just go, well, we did that. We went from 15th to 7th. We missed out on the playoffs by 3 points. Final day action. And everyone here, I know there's plenty of criticisms of the style of play itself. People criticizing that it's boring, that the build-up's too slow, yada, yada, yada. My take on that is that if this is a work in progress, then obviously this season was much better than last, and I would assume that next season's going to be better than this if you keep Rosenior, because that is just how it would work. They would go, okay, this year went pretty well, we did this good, but what we need to work on is making that transition quicker. Yeah. Obviously, that's all sort of moot now because he's gone. But yeah, it just baffles me just completely that can be the justification when that's been the same, that the philosophy, that difference in philosophy about attacking football versus whatever the descriptor for Rosenior's philosophy is. I guess it's slow possession based build up or something.
And the fact as well is, just to provide some context as well, when we talk about boring, turgid football, which is some of the stuff that I've heard sort of lumped Rosenior's way, to compare and contrast 3 different seasons, 2 promotion seasons and a season where we finished 18th. In 2012-13 under Bruce, we scored 61 goals for the season. In 15-16, when we made the playoffs, so we had, Hernandez and Diami and Livermore and Myler and Clucas and everyone else tearing up. We scored 69 goals. So we scored 68 this season. So we scored one more goal in that 15-16 season. And then in 17-18, when we had Slutsky, we had those 5-5 draws and 4-4, all those sorts of crazy games. Yeah, we scored a whole 70 goals. So we scored 2 more goals. So you think that was, this wide open football where we finished 18th in the table and we scored 2 more goals. And that's, I think, the most goals we've ever scored in a championship season. So for us to have scored 68 goals this season and for everyone to be saying, oh, well, yeah, but the style of play is not great. I'm like, well, what are you watching football? Like, no disrespect, but what are you watching football for if you think that, like, presumably they're saying, well, we want more goals. And it's like, but we're actually scoring quite a few goals and we're playing we're playing possession football. So we're actually keeping the ball quite well. And as you say, it's that progression over each season. So yeah, I don't know. I think in some ways he might have actually been hamstrung a bit by that Ipswich game where we did draw 3-3 and the crowd was so into it because there was so much riding on that game. But, I think he's probably looked at that and gone, oh, well, could we get that every week with a better manager? But I don't think you're going to get a game in August or September, even if it was 1-1, 2-2, 3-3 through the course of the game. I don't think you're going to get that same atmosphere because there's just not as much riding on it in that earlier part of the season. But look, we'll start to talk about the season as a whole. We'll start on the positive side of things. Just sort of looking back on highlights and maybe games that stood out for each of you. Maybe if I start with you, Logan, is there a game in particular that stands out in your mind as the game of the season or your favourite moments or memories from the season?
Oh, without doubt. For me, my favourite moment of the season was the away performance against Southampton. I thought that at the time we played them, one of those really big championship clubs. And I can't remember exactly where we were sitting on the table at the time, but I'm pretty certain we were just inside the playoffs and kind of fighting to hold that 6th position. And I just thought, I think it was a midweek game as well from memory. And it just had that kind of feel that, I can see us going there and getting beaten and being like putting in a solid effort. And then, and from that go, oh, well, at least we did our best. That's Southampton. And we went there, turned up at St. Mary's when they were flying and not just like won the game, but really convincingly, like particularly the first half. I think it's in recent memory, it's maybe the best 45 minutes I've watched City play. We really bullied them. And to be able to go to St. Mary's on an occasion like that and do that in the middle, a midweek of such an important fixture against a club of that stature, I thought it really kind of just spoke into the inroads that I felt, Rosenior and the squad had made. Like it was kind of a chance to showcase our new signings as well. And like the optimism, I guess, after that performance about making the 6 was so high for mine. And, as we kind of sit here and reflect, I'm really surprised that we didn't after putting in a performance like that. So, yeah, for me, that was probably the standout, standout performance just because of the nature of it, as opposed to, wasn't exactly the most exciting game. It's like we saw like Philigine's, ridiculous goal. And I know this, like the Ipswich game was probably the most entertaining from a neutral standpoint, but the result and the performance against Southampton was just remarkable.
And how about you, Dan?
This is a tough one. I kind of tend to think like, I don't know if it's necessarily like single games. I just feel like, I think like actually the games against like say Leeds and Leicester, like those two teams that were, for long periods of the season were the top 2, undoubtedly. Obviously Leeds has dropped away a little bit and found themselves in a playoff battle, which I sincerely hope they lose. But I actually found those games against them, against those teams who were at the time in really good form and in really strong positions and were playing probably, some of the better football in the comp, even regardless of, Leicester fans' claims about their manager and their style of play at times that we touched on last week. But I just think that it seemed to be like a sign of a really good team is that, that you can rise to the occasion, you can play to like, meet your opponents. And I think we were there in some sense. As I think, obviously the early 1-0 win over Leicester was really impressive. They were on like a 12-game unbeaten run or something.
I think they'd won all their games even, yeah.
Yeah. And then, you know, the 0-0 with Leeds the first time round was really good. I actually didn't hate as frustrating as
Traore
it
missed
was
though in that one.
there were some frustrating moments, but I think like we went toe to toe with a really strong team, and that was really impressive so early on in the season. I think those were sort of games that helped set the tone for the season to come. Even the return against Leeds, which we fell away late, but I think we competed really well with them for long periods of the game, and it was just, it got to a point where we were desperate to try and get points, and so we sort of overcommitted, and they got us on a counter, and then sort of blew the game away apart a little bit. But I think some of those games, the games against those top teams, almost all of those games, apart from that first game against Ipswich, we like went toe to toe with the top teams in the competition. I think that's probably something that really stood out to me this year. It's just really frustrating. I suppose the flip side of that is when we seem to play some of the weaker teams, we couldn't. We still did that, like played at their level instead of being able to maintain a higher level of play. But I guess that's part of the. Would we, if we still had a progression to be a part of, that would have been a part of it, and you would say, hopefully next year that's improved, and maybe we still do. Hopefully, if it's Tim Walter or someone else comes in, and next season we blow everyone away with our miraculous attacking football, and no one can hold a candle to us, and we, finish with 102 points and all sorts of wonderful things.
Well, yeah, and I'll ask you for your most frustrating game in a second, but for me, and you touched on it there, was definitely the Leicester game early in the season where, I think they'd won their first 6 or 7 games of the season or something like that, and we're sort of going there with not a huge amount of confidence, but we'd started the season reasonably well, and then we get the lap thrown out on the wing, and you're kind of going, it's an interesting decision, changes the shape a bit, changes the style, and we go there, we get the 1-0 win. So not only the win, but also the clean sheet, and you think, I think that for me was that was the first game where you think, okay, we can actually match it with these top teams. Rosenior's actually got more than one way of playing, in the sense that he will change the shape, change the formation, will actually consider what opponent he's coming up against, so that we can mix and match it against the best teams. And it gave us that belief of, okay, we can actually progress up the table. We can compete for these top 6 positions. So that was probably the game of the season for me in that sense. The other one I wanted to just give a shout out to as well was Huddersfield away, where Greaves scores the last, we've gone 1-0 up early. Seems as if it's, the typical sort of City performance of holding that 1-0 lead and then dropping the goal late it was like 92nd minute, I think they scored. And then we immediately go up the other end in the 94th or 95th minute to get the winner. I thought it was a pretty fantastic away day. I'm sure the City fans away at that would have been over the moon with that performance. But I'll throw it back to you now, Logan, for games that were maybe the most disappointing for the season, or sort of when you look back on them. I sort of alluded to the Traore miss perhaps against Leeds, but you look back on some games and just think, geez, on another day we pick up the 3 points there and suddenly our season looks completely different. Or maybe not even would have picked up the 3 points, like you got the Stoke game or the Swansea game where we could have played for 2 days and not scored.
It's actually one of those funny ones that the more you think about it, the more you can kind of nitpick and be, upset at performances. I think I cast my mind back to Norwich on the opening day and how annoying that, the call was. I know that they probably, well, I say arguably, but definitely were the better side across 90 minutes. But the fact that it was a very, very contentious call. Well, let's not go down the politically correct path. It was a horrific call. The ball was definitely out, and the fact that they were able to rob the 3 points on the opening day was a little bit frustrating. I thought the return leg of Stoke at the MKM we lost 2-0 after being like Stoke are, traditionally one of those teams that we really struggle against, and to beat them, I think it was 3-1. Earlier on, that was a very pleasing performance. I think maybe Connolly got a brace that day, and really, like, they're particularly the form that Stoke are in. They're the types of games that we should definitely be. Well, I say winning. I think we can control possession that day, like in massive amounts as well. And then I guess even cast your mind back to as recently as Plymouth on the last day. Like, there's some pretty bad howlers in there. yeah, the Traore miss. So like, but I do feel like we can sit here and reflect on that. Every team has those ones. But if I had to put my kind of hang my hat on one, I think that Stoke one for me was just so disappointing, given the form we were in. I think we'd maybe just drawn to Leicester. And then
just before the break, yeah.
Yeah. And I think we'd had a draw against maybe Preston before that. So it was kind of one of those games that we really needed to collect 3 points on and just didn't.
Yeah. How about you, Dan?
As with the good games, I've got like a raft of games that spring to mind. Both of the Norwich games for different reasons, which I think we've already touched on previously. But yeah, the ball going out, the bloody, I think it's Gunn cleaning up Connolly, and a bunch of other things that happened in that set in the return leg. The Plymouth game for obvious reasons, and the other one that was really, really frustrating for me was actually the 2-2 with Swansea, where
we
I
were
finally
sitting there together watching it.
Got down to cheers, got out to meet you, have a beer with you, watch some City, and the first 45 was absolutely atrocious, and just sitting there amidst like all of the other Premier League fans who were like almost looking down on us for supporting City and getting the sort of condescending, like, oh, how are you guys going thing, and oh, you guys should beat Swansea, their shit, right? And all of that. It was just from a pure fan's perspective was so frustrating to sit there and watch that out in public. But yeah, I guess like those are probably the main ones, because particularly the ones that what does it for me with the Norwich games is that if those few things go in our favor, we probably actually make the playoffs.
Yeah.
like you go, that goal doesn't count because it's gone out, and we if we're 2 points closer to Norwich, then Gunn gets sent off like he should, and there's something else I can't remember that happens in that game. Is there another ball that goes out for something?
There was the elbow on Coyle, I think, about 10 minutes later, which should have been a straight red card, which I think the linesman even saw, and I think he got a yellow card for it, which is just ridiculous.
So there's some really weird things we go, if those things go in our favor and we actually pick up more points against Norwich, then suddenly like they're not 3 points clear of us, they're a point behind us maybe instead. And it is one of those things. I'm sure there's plenty of things that rose tinted glasses where decisions we're overlooking to not mention that have gone in our favor, but those were particularly frustrating moments with teams that were that finished just above us.
Yeah, and for me, it's very much a similar train of thought, but I've gone with the West Brom game at home, the 1-1, where it was more our own doing than anything that the officials did. But I think Palmer got into the team of the season, I think, which still boggles my mind to this day. And maybe we just saw him on one of his worst days of the season. But it seemed as if the West Brom keeper that day, everything that he did was just horrendous. Like he was, he'd be standing on the ball and we'd press him and he'd just clear it out of play, or he'd misplace a pass or a touch or anything like that. He was palming saves back into play, all that sort of thing. And it just reminded me of sort of Sunday League when you're playing a team which has a terrible goalkeeper. And I'm sitting there in defense, not having a chance to take any shots, saying to my teammates, test the keeper, get shots away, basically shot on target's a goal, and we have one shot for the game and we lose it 2-0 or something. And you're going, well, if we'd had more shots, we actually probably would have won this game pretty comfortably. And it felt like that against West Brom, where I was like, if, Carvalho scores that screamer in the first half, and then I think it's Philogene in the second half who really gives them their goal through a bit of poor defending or a poor marking. And you just think, that really should have been 3 points. And again, similar to the Norwich games, you think suddenly if we're taking 3 points against West Brom, they're probably finishing beneath us in the table, or it's a lot closer on final day at least. So yeah, frustrating. I mean, Birmingham probably is the other one to shout out, where we were 1-0 up, and that's that sort of typical throwing goals away late through maybe being a bit too conservative, which, look, it's a criticism we've seen of Rosenior all season, but I do think a little bit in his favor on that is it does get quite hard when you have a guy like Philogene on the pitch. I know we've spoken about this through the season, but a guy like Philogene on the pitch, and sometimes, whether it's Delap or someone else, Carvalho as well, because they can perform at the drop of a hat and score a goal out of nowhere. It's really hard if they're not performing, for Rosenia to pull them off, because they could score a goal out of nothing, and all of a sudden you've been a genius for leaving them on. Like Philogene against Rotherham scoring the Rabona. You're like, well, if he'd been pulled off because he'd been playing poorly, then that doesn't happen. And so you see them inevitably be left on the pitch for the full 90 minutes. And then you kind of get these games where they don't perform, and then we do concede a late soft goal, which can be pretty frustrating. But look, let's QPR away, Chef Wednesday away as well. 2 games where just dropping points to pretty poor teams, and injuries to Delap and Philogene in those games as well. Look, there's plenty of games. But what we'll do, we'll move on. We'll talk through our predictions from preseason and sort of see how we went with those, and then we'll crown our player of the season. Keeping in mind that this prediction episode was sort of end of July, so it was a month before the window closed. So we didn't have Philogene, we didn't have who else would have signed after that point? I suppose Morton, obviously, guys like that, and obviously the January signings as well. But we did suggest that our signing of the season. I'm going to give the points to Logan on this one almost by default, because Dan and I both said Vinagre. But Logan did say Connolly. 7 or 8 goals from Connolly is a pretty decent return, Logan. So you must be happy with that prediction.
We only played about 8 games, so that's incredible.
Yeah. I was going to say, Alex, your introduction to this segment actually made me think that you were just trying to buy more time because of how much of a poor prediction it ended up being in Vinagre. And I'm glad Dan was in company with you for that, because I reckon I could have made a case that at halfway through the season, Connolly could have been our season, our player of the season, or there or thereabouts. Actually, it definitely would have been Philogene, but his wishful thinking. I think, like as Dan just said, with the amount of games that Connolly played, maybe for the amount of games per goal return or influence, I think he could have been our player of the season. So thanks for awarding me the points in this particular section. I think that might be the only thing that I'll be able to call success on from the intro pod.
And then I suppose in retrospect now, looking back on those signings from the summer, who would you, we can include January in this as well, but who would you put down as our signing of the season?
For the season, I think it has to be Philogene. I think that there's not really a case that can be made. Although maybe you can't even really say Carvalho, because that was you can. It was a loan signing for half of the season, and the influence he had was remarkable. But across the board throughout the season, I would absolutely Philogene. Would you agree, Dan?
Yes and no. I'm content. I want to argue the point a little bit. I 100% Philogene on his day, his talent, the skill and technical ability that he possesses, and he did end up with a decent output for the season in terms of goals and assists. But I actually just found him really inconsistent throughout the year. He had a nice little purple patch at one point where you just knew like he was going to be dangerous, but there was a big chunk of the season where I was really not that impressed with what he was doing, and he looked lazy, looked like he wasn't really doing a lot, and the caveat being that if Delap had stayed fit for a full season, I think he takes that place of player of the season, and because he was right behind, he's right behind Philogene on goals, and missed a big chunk of the season. Came back had 4 appearances and scored a goal in them after a 3-month or 4-month injury. So I will concede Philogene in this moment, for this season, but just with the caveat that had Delap been fit for the whole thing, I think he would have been it, and the price tag of 10 million that's been put on him probably would have been doubled.
Yeah, there's an interesting question I'll pose you both about Philogene a bit later on in the episode, but we'll talk most improved. For me, first of all, for best signing of the season, I'd probably. I'd almost go with Carvalho for impact, like 9 goals or 8. I think it was 9 goals in the end in something like 18 games played. Is a pretty remarkable return. And as Dan was saying earlier, I mean, for him to bed in as quickly as he did, you think like that first game he played for us on the mud patch of a pitch that was the MKM at the time. to get a 9-goal return out of him was, I think, remarkable. And he really sort of kept us in that playoff race in the second half of the season with his output, I thought. Most improved for the season. So it's almost flipped here. I think I'd give the chocolates to Dan and myself, who again went the same player with Tufan over Slater, who, I mean, look, it can be said, I think he's had a really good season and looked really impressive in those big games against Southampton and Leicester, in Slater's case, that is. But I think Tufan, just in terms of his output, and also you look at like that purple patch we had to end the season, well, not purple patch so much, but when we were sort of flicking the switch against, the QPR at home and Ipswich and so on, Tufan, I think, really sort of shone through in that starting 11 with Omer. So yeah, I'll give you the chance to speak on that one, Dan.
I can't really complain. Pick Tufan. I think he last year or last season, struggled a little bit with injury, missed a fair bit of the season, but showed the potential. Didn't look like anything like the player that what the Watford fans were trying to tell us he was. That he was just a fat, lazy so-and-so who wasn't going to do anything. I think he really seemed to shine under Rosenia, and again just went up another level this season, and started the season really strongly. Another frustrating little injury, sort of when he was sort of getting up to form, and he got 4 goals or something real early in the season this year, and we went, he's just gonna kick on, he's just gonna keep going, and then another frustrating injury, not as long as last season's one, I think, but it was an interesting one with him, because I found like we were saying, like, with all of the attacking talents that we had, especially once they all started to come back in those last handful of games, that we're going like, who do you take off? And unfortunately, like, Tufan became sort of the one who you just went, he's not like, he's not even, but wasn't necessarily the weakest of those players, but just was the man who had to make way. I guess you would argue he's maybe like the least dynamically athletic of the players that we had available. But in terms of like skill, I think that screamer from the edge of the box was sensational and really showed what he could do. I think a couple of shitty penalties this year that last year was great from the spot, and this year just couldn't get it to work. But Tufan was I think showed how important he can be for the team, and I've become even more of a fan than I kind of already was.
And is there anyone that you would say improved more than him, or you think he's a pretty deserving name?
It's a good, I don't know, like, it's hard.
I want to jump through the screen.
If Logan's got an idea, let him speak.
I just can't. I guess on this particular thing, I can't see how there's any case to be made outside of Matty Jacob. I think that from where he was to where he finds himself at the end of the season, he's certainly not anyone. We actually may have mentioned him in the introduction pod, the first episode of the season, hoping to see glimpses of him, but I don't think we expected that he'd kind of not only feature in the first team frequently, but to really kind of concrete down his spot towards the end. I thought he just he's come on leaps and bounds, and the reason I think this is because I would have put my house on Harry Vaughan being this most improved kind of signing outside of Slater. And I remember it being a really tough kind of toss up between those two, and Matty Jacob is just the name that for mine has had a remarkable 2024.
Yeah, and in terms of the academy player to break through, I think we all went with Andy Smith almost by default because he'd been playing a bit in preseason. I know Matty Jacob did pick up an injury, so he might have been a bit further from our minds when we did that prediction. But yeah, I think similar for the academy player, Jacob's obviously the one who's come through. The interesting question that we had, the Hullenbach boys also said that it's a funny question that I, for whatever reason, thought I'd throw in there, which was, would Rosenia still be in charge at the end of the season? And I suppose on a technicality, he was. We all did say yes, he would be. But it's about as close, cutting it as close to the wire as you can get with whether he was or wasn't.
Yeah,
But,
I feel like on that one there is if there's anyone in world football outside of Tan and Ajun who could make the case for Rosenior not being there, I'd like to meet them, because the Rosenior out comments, I thought, for as how do I say this, as unpleasant a fan base the keyboard warriors from City can be when they're dealing with emotions, post loss, and I'm sure that they would have been many after the Plymouth fixture. But the fact that he's not there now, I think, is not just a surprise to us, but it's probably a massive surprise to Liam Rosenior himself. So I think we can cut ourselves some slack on this one, but a very funny question.
yeah, absolutely. In terms of finishing positions, Dan, I think, was probably closest to the pin, because he sort of cheated. He had a range. He said
I did. I cheated. I gave a range. It's like
yeah,
7th to 10th or something. It wasn't really a
yeah.
specific number.
I said
I just
10.
would. Well, my question is, like, when you asked for the predictions of finishing position, did you ask? Did you want me? Did you specifically say that you needed a specific position, like
No, I think that's fair
number
enough,
position? So
because
I'm just
I think
saying,
you can
loopholes.
yeah, and I think you can tend to throw a blanket over that sort of finishing position anyway, because it doesn't take much to finish, ninth or finish 7th. Really, it tends to only be a couple of points either way. So I think Logan had 6th, I had 10th, you had 7th to 10th. So we've basically all come in around the mark. And probably highlights as well that, whilst we had heightened expectations, we weren't sitting there saying, oh, we will finish 3rd or 4th. And in which case, we're sort of saying this has been a poor season. It's clearly been, about on par with what we were hoping for. So you can't be too unhappy, I suppose, with how that all finished up. I'll do player of the season last, because then we'll go into who actually won our player of the season. But we also had top goal scorer predictions. I think mine of Oscar kind of gets ruled out by default, although he did score 1 goal in the cup for us. Dan had 2 fan, which wasn't too bad a shout in the end, because what did he finish up on? I think he got 10 goals or something, so he was only just behind Philogene, I think, in the end.
Let's have a look.
And Logan, of course, stuck to his guns with Connolly, who got the 8 goals as well. So when you think, obviously Philogene wasn't at the club at the time, I think by that logic, Dan actually comes out on top on that one.
Mate,
well, it's actually he's actually equal with Philogene in all competitions.
Oh, well, there you go.
According to this website, according to this site, they both end up with 12 goals in all competitions.
He must have scored
in cup games. I don't know which
I'm
ones.
just trying to
Maybe
think.
did he come off the bench against Birmingham or something in the weird double?
Well, because Jacob got the equaliser in that, and Lakilo got the goal in the game that we couldn't watch. He must have scored in. I'm going to have a look as well.
I'm just still coming to terms with how high on the Connolly stock I was at the beginning of the season.
Clearly, you were just
a player of the season.
It was very exciting. He showed some promise last season. We lured him away. We lured him here on a yearly deal. It was big news at the time.
But there you go. And so then I guess I'll finish us off with who you each thought was our player, who was player of the season for you, and then we'll go in with the one that we got the votes for. So maybe Dan, who was your player of the season?
Oh, this is a tough one. There's lots of names that come to mind. Particularly my favorite 2 fan comes to mind a lot, because I think lots of output. You look at those, the goals, a few assists, those sorts of things. But I think and I don't actually think he got. I don't feel like we gave him as many votes as he probably deserved throughout the season. And I think I might actually have a shirt on at the moment. Is Jacob Greaves, who I mean, obviously he cleaned up at the City Awards night, but I just think his growth over the last couple of seasons has been phenomenal. From a really good young centre back to a genuine leader in a team where he is still one of the youngest in that team, and made team of the season. Scored an important goal. lots of really solid, lots of really impressive defensive work. I think he really bullied some really dangerous strikers around this season as well. I think the way that he went about his game this season and took on that leadership mantle was really impressive, particularly as we got into the business end of the season and we started getting in positions where something needed to happen and he would pick up the ball and he would we started driving down the left into that hole, getting forward. I think there's one, I can't remember which game it was, but a series of wonderful 1-2s that ended up with him in the box and all he had to do was put it past the keeper and he just couldn't. But like, where he just went, like, someone needs to make something happen and I'm here and give me the ball and I'll do something. And I think that sort of is impressive for someone who, what is he, 23 now?
Yeah,
something
yeah,
like that.
22, 23, yeah.
Like to be that, to take on that role and that within the team is really impressive. So I think he is one who, as I said, I think week to week maybe didn't get the plaudits that he probably deserved a lot of the time from, like, especially from us. I think I don't remember voting for him that frequently.
Oh yeah, we're clueless.
But I think overall, a really influential player on the pitch and in the dressing room. So.
Yeah, how about you, Logan?
I was really upset that you went to Dan first because I thought I was going to share some Jacob Greaves insight. And I do kind of want to echo everything that Dan said. But I think when you first asked the question, it kind of jumped to mind that I think Delap and Philogene are probably the ones that have stood out like consistently because we, associate, well, with Philogene, it's probably flair, but also like assists and goals. And then Dan's already, spoken about the influence that Delap's had. But the big thing for me is both of those guys have spent some, pretty significant time on the sidelines as well. And I think one of the things that you've kind of got to add to the Jacob Greaves, stock is the fact that he's incredibly durable. We've played him out of position at times to, fill on one of those left, right back, roles. And the fact that he plays nearly every game, popped up for a brace. I think, Alex, there was a whoscored.com. He might have got the first, or one of the first Hull players, perfect 10s, because I think he kept the clean sheet and scored a brace. And, that, as Dan said, I don't think that we have given him his chocolates in the voting. And it's probably because sometimes he just goes under the radar because he's just that good. And you kind of almost expect him to be that solidly defensive week in, week out. And yes, sure, there's areas for improvement in his game. He's finishing, although from a centre back, that's not necessarily the first trait that you look for. If you actually do reflect in hindsight on the balance of the season, he's been remarkable across the 46 games. And I would probably say him as well. I think that it's underestimated just how big a role he's had in this season for us. And if he is to move on next year, there's going to be I say next season, not next year. There's going to be some very, very big shoes to fill.
Yeah, I think that's the thing with him, because he played so consistently at a solid level. You almost, I think with our voting, it almost comes down to more out of the box performances. And as you say, I think that sort of lends itself to those flair players like a Philogene or someone that's scoring important goals or making those massive runs like Delap, where they sort of stand out even in a poor game necessarily. You kind of go, well, Delap's still sort of harrying the defense, or Philogene, might be, having his shots or whatever. And you can still kind of cast your mind to them. Whereas for Greaves, you kind of sometimes fall into the trap of lumping the whole defense together into one basket. And you go, well, the defense was reasonable. Okay, well, maybe one week you're saying, well, that might mean I'll give a vote to Jones or to Allsop or to Coyle or whoever, rather than Greaves, when I think, as you guys say, I think he was such a consistent performer for us through the season. And I think, judging by his tears against Plymouth and his sort of farewells, I think it does seem as if he's pretty much gone, which is a real shame. Like I'd love to see him give it one more season to say, well, we're right on the cusp of the playoffs. If I stay one more season, I could captain my hometown club up into the Premier League. I think that would be massive. But also don't begrudge him if he was to move on this summer. It feels a lot different to when Lewis Potter left, where it felt like Lewis Potter was leaving much too soon. Whereas with Greaves, I think he's certainly shown that he has, basically achieved all there is for him to achieve in the championship. He made team of the season, everything like that. So he's more than ready to make the step up. But look, I'll announce our player of the season based on our voting through the season. And then there's actually a funny player on here I want to discuss as well. But the Tigers Down Under player of the season for 23-24 is Jaden Philogene, just scraping in ahead of Liam Delap. And I think that actually does serve to the point that you guys have mentioned. If Delap had stayed fit, I think he probably would have edged it over Philogene. There's a massive gap. So the votes for the top 5, Philogene on 67, Liam Delap 63, and then Ozan Tufan on 48. So that's a pretty sizable jump down from second to third. The player in fourth is the one that I'm going to touch on as a rather controversial one, which is Ryan Allsop coming in on 42, and then Jacob Greaves on 40 as well. So he did get some recognition there, perhaps not as much as he deserved, but some nevertheless. Ryan Allsop, who on the Tahalan Back podcast last night, they were saying was basically one of the most overrated players at City and worst signings of the season, etc. Because I can fully take the point that he's conceded some soft goals and all that sort of thing. And I think he's at the top of some pretty poor metrics for goalkeepers. But I think coming back to the point on Philogene and Delap, when he had a good game, he had a really good game. So like that Middlesbrough game, even Plymouth on the final day, his first couple of games as well, like that Stoke game where he's pinging passes around to players, he looked really good, and that's clearly why he's found himself in the votes. But I thought that, it's sort of the quirk of the voting system that, these players just pop up based on, the weight of the season and how we saw things. But it's a name that I wouldn't have thought of as one of my top 5 players of the season. But what did you make of those votes, Logan?
Yeah, look, I wanted to have a punt when you said before we went to air. You said, once we do the player of the season voting, there's a really big surprise in the top 5. And I actually thought, I bet he's talking about Ryan Allsop, and I think it probably just speaks into he really is that rocks and diamonds goalkeeper. Like he's either being talked about for having an awesome game, or he's being slated saying we need to get rid of him because he's not championship caliber, or he's made a silly error trying to play out, which largely is one of the pressure points of playing the Rosenior style, is that Ryan Allsop is going to be, put under the microscope each week. And so that really doesn't shock me. I guess the other factor across the, the balance of the season in the player of the season voting, although that kind of doesn't work because 2 players who miss extended periods of time also finished first and second in our voting, but also played almost every game as well. And so that, has a huge influence where he could just kind of pick up these 1, 2, 3 points across and just keep chugging along. So it doesn't surprise me in the slightest. I would be really surprised if he's the first choice keeper next year, next season. But with that being said, he has had some pretty impressive performances. He's had some dog breakfasts as well, but he's an interesting player, that's for sure.
It's funny looking back at our past winners. So the first player of the season we had was George Honeyman, and then the second was Keane Lewis Potter, which I think both of those players in those seasons won the club player of the season as well. And then last year we had Seri, whereas the club had Jones, and now this year we've got Philogene, the club's got Greaves. It's interesting to see the divergence somewhat in either, I suppose, what gets valued the most, or else I suppose on what stands out to us when we're watching these games. But Dan, what did you make of the breakdown?
It's not too unsurprising, like overall, just even including Allsop, when you sort of take a second to, like, when you first see his name there, you go, this must be a mistake. Alex obviously can't add up properly, but like, as Logan was saying, like, he has had some shockers, but I actually feel like those shockers really were like fairly few and far between. Like the actual goals that he caused from playing out the back, from poor decision making. Yes, I feel like there were quite a few. There was a lot of near misses. The near misses were more regular than the actual goals caused from his mistakes. But I actually feel like he doesn't also get the credit that he's due for when he does have those good games. Because I think there were games where he had outstanding games, like the Middlesbrough game with the huge like double or triple save late in the game, those sorts of moments. And a big chunk of the fan base who are, I guess, they're Allsop haters or whatever, and they don't rate him. And you go, well, what about, he made those huge saves, and they go, yeah, but he's a goalkeeper. He's supposed to make saves. And you're like, well, that doesn't, I just feel like there's that sort of attitude around, particularly goalkeepers and the scrutiny that they come under. If they don't make a save, they should have made the save. If they make the save, well, they're supposed to make the save. And there's almost no situation where they get credit for making a save, unless it's like an absolute worldie of a save, and they've, dove from bottom left to top right to like punch the ball out for down the other end to score their own goal. Like, it's something ridiculous. Like, I don't know. I just feel like there's in some ways there's undue criticism placed on goalkeepers, where I think over the last few seasons we've had a series of not outstanding but dependable and reliable goalkeepers, and they have all copped an unnecessary amount of shit from the fan base.
Yeah. The question that I was going to ask as well, which was another one posed by the to Hallenbach boys, and it does relate to our winner of the player of the season, so it might undermine our voting somewhat. But it was a question that I found it was a point of view that I found myself agreeing with even before they named Philogene as the player they were talking about, was, do you think that there's a case to be made for Philogene actually being our most overrated player, in the sense that whilst he's performed, absolutely he's performed, and he's scored the 12 goals and he's got the 6 or 7 assists or whatever it might be, as you were sort of saying earlier, Dan, the inconsistency in his game, the way that he would sometimes slow the game down unnecessarily or take shots when he should be passing the ball off or things like that, just shows that there's a lot of areas of his game to work on. And I think I'm certainly been guilty of saying, oh, he's worth the 30, the 40 million price tag or whatever. That when you actually take that step back and look at him as a player at the moment, of course he can improve. Of course he's 21, he's going to improve. He's still quite young. Is there a case to be made that our fan base is actually overrating Philogene, or is that just sort of, setting an impossible standard for him to fulfill?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I suppose like it's kind of the flip side of that same what we're just saying about Allsop. But I suppose, like to a degree, he is he's a little overrated. He's underperforming like a little bit, but I think it's also an unfair statement to make, because we're making that judgment based on this perceived idea of potential. Where you go, this is a player who has lots of potential, and we're saying, yes, he's performed, but he could do so much better. And it's, again, this unrealistic thing where if you just look at the figures and you go, a winger in his first season at the club, 12 goals, 6 assists, that's a good return. Yep, he was a little bit I felt like he was a little bit inconsistent and has that room for improvement. But like, he only paid 5 million?
5 million, yeah.
With then like there's the weird buybacks and whatnot if we get to the Prem, but like 5 million for that kind of return is not terrible. Like, I think like it's worked out fairly well. If he'd come back and only scored 6 goals or something, you'd be going, well, that's a waste of 5 million. But I think the return was decent enough that as much as we sit here and we say, there's definitely stuff for him to work on, I don't think I wouldn't necessarily maybe rate him as overrated, just based on those metrics and the statistics and the figures at the end of the season. But yeah.
What
did you think about it, Logan? It's an interesting one.
Look, quite simply, my answer is no. I think that as Dan said, for £5 million, he's 22 years old or something like that. He chipped in with as many goals as he did. He has huge influence on games. Sure, there's definitely some negative things that need work. I feel like that's kind of part and parcel of player development, and I think it will come. It actually reminds me, there's parallels between him and a very young Cameron Stewart, if you cast your mind back that far. But he was that type of player that every single time he touched the ball, there was some kind of like aura around what he was going to do with it. And that to me is just it's kind of the apt time frame that's required for a player that has those types of skills. Like you said, the guys scoring fluky Rabonas and then also spraying like sitters that he probably should just side foot and finish simply. So it'll happen. I think that we've got ourselves a remarkable player. I really hope he stays. I hope that.
I was just going to ask if you think he's still got that room for improvement, whether it means he should stay.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think, in many ways, I think that he will probably, if he was to feature in like the Premier League, it'd probably be like a Keane Lewis Potter kind of role where he'd be benched and like chime in here and there. But I don't think that the playing time that would be afforded to him, at least initially, would reflect where he's at in his development. And I think another championship season under a good manager, and particularly if it is rumored to be this high voltage attack, offensive all out strategy that we might be employing next year, it will probably really suit his playing style. So I've been really happy with him, and I think that for a 22-year-old, it's remarkable what he's accomplished.
Fair enough. And then I'll start with you, Logan, just with closing thoughts, maybe a rating out of 10 for the season and what you're hoping to see over the summer, and whether it's signings or manager or anything like that.
Look, my rating would be 8 out of 10. I thought that we projected exactly where we kind of expected. I mean, you talked about our predictions at the start between the three of us. We picked from, thanks Dan for broadening the horizons a bit, but from 6th to 10th, and we ended up 7th. We missed out on the final day. We had a couple of really tricky results that, had they gone a different way, we could have cruised into the playoffs. And so I think that for what I saw from the playing group and the fans and the club, there was such a feel good factor this season. Like, I don't think that when we think about the size of the crowds that went to the MKM, the relationship at least on display between Ajun and Liam and the fans, it was finally like, we weren't expecting perfection, but I felt like we had a lot to get excited about, and it looked like we were heading in such a promising direction. I actually really liked Liam Rosinha's post-match interviews. I thought he gave the fans a really good insight as to where he was heading, and it just spoke so kind of optimistically of the players. So it was a really fun ride. I think this is probably one of the seasons I, as a fan, have enjoyed the most in recent memory, and that's without any playoff games or any your crazy cup runs or anything like that, but there was a really good feel good factor around the club, and so for that, I was really happy with it. I think you asked something else, but I can't remember.
Yeah, well, what are you looking to see over the summer? In terms of whether it's, I guess, particular signings you're hoping for us to make, or anything about the manager coming in that you'd want to see.
Well, I guess that throwing out these predictions now is kind of the same as a Vinagre player of the season kind of thing. We just don't know what to expect. I think that if they go and get the Hamburg manager, Tim, what's his name, in the next couple of days, and that's secured, then I guess then we can start to kind of get excited. But it's with FIFA fair play and the financial restrictions. Like, if Greaves goes, that's going to leave a massive hole. If Philogene gets sold on, there's just so many unknowns that I would like to keep as much of this current core as we can. But given the fact that we had so many loan players, that's obviously not going to happen. So I know that in the interest of the podcast, we want some kind of answer, but I'm just not willing to give anything. And look, I'm happy to be slated for it, but I'm still in shock that we're looking at appointing a new gaffer, and apparently the playing style that we're committed to is no longer a thing. So it's just too hard to answer for me at the moment. So I apologise for disappointing all. But what I would love to see is Carvalho return as a permanent.
There you go.
That's what I'd like.
How about you, Dan?
So to the first question of the rating, or the second question about what I want for next season?
You can go with both if you want.
Go with both. All right. So I'm, I guess, a very equivalent, but I'll actually go 9 out of 10 as a rating for the overall for the season. I thought it was just a sensational ride. Pretty much of Doctor Point, which is combined with two things because they're very heavily linked. It's basically not making playoffs / promotion, and then home form. That's pretty much what I've docked a point for, because just about everything else was sensational. We played some really good football. We got, as Logan said, the crowd's back. We had full MKMs. So I mean, what can you there's not really too much to complain about to say that this was like a failure of a season. So pretty positive there. And in terms of making predictions for what we want for next season, those sorts of things, I think the fun of making these predictions is looking at how horribly wrong we get them. So that's the only reason I boo you, Logan, because as hilarious as it is to say that we predicted Vinagre to be the most influential player for this season, and then him to play like 5 games and then get shipped back home, it's hilarious. But it does go to your point that like football's just such a funny game, and you never know what's around the corner. I kind of echo what Logan was saying. Like, one of the main things is securing that manager really quickly. And it seemed like the only real name who's ever been mentioned in any seriousness is Tim Walter, and it seems like it's very close.
I prefer Tim What's his face. I think that's a good name for him.
I thought he was pretty close.
It's pretty close, yeah.
It's a trauma response.
I just thought there was like a German like umlaut or something in there that just made it be pronounced differently that I wasn't aware of. But so I think that's for me. That's the first thing, is get that down. My main hope for next season is that we actually can keep a hold of Greaves and Philogene. I really think my in terms of splashing the cash on someone, my hope would be Delap. I would really love to spend the 10 million and get him back. But I do also recognize that there are, as we touched on, with so many loan players that are vacating, there's quite a few holes that need to be filled. And with FFP and those sorts of things, do we have the finances? I mean, we've got lots of other players that we could sell to try and bridge the gap. But we lose Morton out of the center of the park, who started most games. I suppose Slater slots similarly into that sort of position, but there's some concerns about, I guess, putting all our eggs in the one basket. But I'd be pretty ecstatic if all of those eggs went in the Liam Delap basket. So
yeah, and I think I'd probably maybe fall in the middle of both of you and say 8.5 out of 10 for the season. I thought it was a pretty solid season. Can't complain about too much. As you say, I think it's really just the home form that let us down a little bit. But outside of that, it's about as good as we could have hoped for. So I was pretty happy with the season. To, Logan's joke about getting Carvalho back, to think if we'd been sitting here doing the predictions episode, even floating the idea of Fabio Carvalho joining City at some point that season was just a wild pipe dream at that point. So,
well, I think even when it was mentioned for January, we all went he was in Germany at a Champions League club. Like at a really high quality club, and to get recalled and then get sent to the Championship, you're like, there's no way this is happening. It kind of reminded me a little bit of the Seri coup that we pulled off last in the season previous.
Yeah, I actually went to an A-League game with Mitch, and one of his mates was a Liverpool supporter, and I jokingly said to him, I see Carvalho's been recalled from Leipzig. Any chance he wants to play with Morton in the Championship? And we were all sort of joking about it, and sure enough, that's what happened. So, yeah, look, there's so many unpredictable twists and turns that can happen, but I think for me, it's really just getting some business done early, whether that's outgoings or incomings. Like, you look at, say, Ryan Longman, who's had a really successful loan spell with Millwall. They want to sign him permanently. Ryan Woods at Exeter in the same sort of basket. If we get those two deals to sell them done early, to then give us a bit of flexibility to, maybe not, go after a Delap, but, start to get some players coming in before we, it takes the pressure off selling a Philogene or a Greaves if you get some money coming in from those other guys, where you can suddenly sit there and say, well, we're actually in a position to keep them if they don't want to, if they're not pushing for a departure, we're not financially pressured into selling them. And in some ways, that's also just helpful to push the fees up for them if that's the case. But yeah, I think seeing some business done probably in June, I think is the main thing for me. I think we're already looking like we're making the right sounds with manager coming in as soon as possible, so he'll get a chance to look at the list of players that he wants to retain, whether that's Traore, Christie, Doherty, those sorts of guys. If any of them have a place in the squad for next season, but I think there'll be a lot of turnover. So when we're back for our first episode of the season, previewing next season, there'll be a lot of fresh faces to discuss, I am sure. But I just wanted to say as well, thank you to both of you, as well as the other Tigers Down Under panelists who've been on over the course of this season. It's been a great one, as we've just said. We've had a great season.
Yeah, well, thanks for having us on throughout the year. It felt like there was a period of time where I was on just about every week, but it's good to be on. It's an enjoyable part of my week when I'm able to get on and talk some football. And I look forward to being able to do it again in the what are we going 2024-25 season of the championship.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and thank you, Logan.
Alex, it's my pleasure, and I know that I speak for all the other boys that this thing doesn't take place if you don't go and do all the legwork and administrative stuff behind the scenes. So yeah, like I agree with Dan totally. It's a good time to get on, particularly when we're going well. And I think that's kind of in a weird way, it's kind of therapeutic when you have those really bad losses, and all you want to do is vent and discuss the big city issues. So it's a very nice outlet, and it's always good fun. So yeah, thanks for all the work you do preparing it and getting it out. And I look forward to, like you said, the episodes to launch next season, when there's going to be a whole lot more to discuss, and hopefully a promotion to also be talking about.
Absolutely. All the best for next season. I think it's going to be an exciting one way or another, with this high tempo football that we're being promised. So it's going to be a massive, exciting ride, I think. So we'll look forward to previewing all of that in just a couple of months. It'll all start all over again. But look, until then, thank you everyone for listening as well this season. It's been awesome having everyone along for the ride. And we're looking forward to doing it all again next season. But until then, come on, City.